Thanks. No, I'm not going to talk about statistics tonight, you'll be relieved to hear, although I can, so please feel free to ask me to talk about statistics. I know, I live in hope. Anyway, I'm going to talk a bit about the ethical perspective tonight, so I've got my ethicist hat on, and I guess a lot of what we've heard tonight, and I think a lot of what doctors and other healthcare workers try to do, is avoid getting to the point of having to say no. So at the point where we are thinking about saying no to a patient's request for surgery, it's where the sort of shared decision-making process is broken down. What we really want is to explain to the patient what their risk is as best we can determine it, what their prognosis is, what's most likely to happen. We get their values, their concerns, what they would like to happen, and together we come to a consensus about what we're going to do. Now, that doesn't always work, and I think even despite making vast amounts of effort to make it work, there's sometimes going to be disagreements. And in this particular case, we're talking about disagreements where the surgeon thinks the patient should not have surgery, the patient or their surrogate decision maker thinks that that patient should have surgery. So what do we do in that kind of case? We often like to talk about things like futility, and I've got Sisyphus there who's pushing his boulder repeatedly up the hill. So we might think, in that kind of case, surgery is futile, or it's not in the patient's best interests. And to unpack that, we might say something like, it's very unlikely that surgery in this case is actually going to achieve the therapeutic aims, or what we're intending to do, or what the patient is intending to do by that surgery. If we refuse, though, and the patient actually does understand what's going on and does have a preference for surgery, we're being paternalistic. So we're acting, if we say, it's in your best interests not to have surgery, even though you want it, therefore I'm saying no to you, we're acting paternalistically. We're acting for the patient's own good, but without regard to their own wishes. And paternalism has a bit of a bad rep in medical care, probably justifiably so. We've gone away from a paternalistic model and towards a model where we respect the patient's autonomy. We say we respect your wishes. As long as they're competent, as long as you understand what you're doing. I might disagree with what you're doing, but if you're an autonomous person, we respect that. Now, that's the sort of presumption that we don't like paternalism. It's not always unjustified to act paternalistically. So I've got, Mr. Vincent van Gogh up there, and you can imagine that, you all know the story, right? Vincent van Gogh supposedly cut off his own ear because he was experiencing auditory hallucinations and he thought cutting off his ear might stop them. So you could imagine Mr. van Gogh turning up and saying, can you please perform surgery to cut off my ear to get rid of my auditory hallucinations? And you might think as a doctor that you would say, no. I'm not going to cut off your ear. And in this case, because it would be medically inappropriate, right? It's not going to achieve the aims that he intends to achieve by it, right? And in this case as well, he doesn't actually understand the nature of his condition, right? And perhaps he's not fully competent as a person. So in this case, we might paternalistically say, no, I'm not going to cut your ear off. And because you don't actually understand first of all, what is actually wrong with you and what ought to be done to fix it, and the fact that what you're asking for is not going to fix it. So that would be a case probably of justified paternalism. On the other hand, if he's just going to go cut his own ear off, you might sort of think maybe you should do something else, stop him. But probably cutting his ear off for him is not the right way to go. Nevertheless, if it's just that the person doesn't understand the nature of the choice, we usually should make all of the efforts we can to try and get them to understand the nature of their choice. And I think that's what's behind all of the efforts that we try to make to say, can we explain risk to patients in a way that they will actually absorb that? Can we explain likely prognosis or what it would be like to live, with significant complications from the surgery? Nevertheless, if we're thinking about saying no to a patient on the basis that it's not in their best interests, we then are claiming that either they themselves are not competent to make that decision, or that they're actually not really understanding for themselves what's in their best interests. And that might sometimes be true, but it's a bit of a problematic claim to make. I think one of the things that we have to understand when we have these kinds of disagreements about whether surgery is worth the risks is that it's not just a question about facts. So we've talked a lot about probabilities and risk prediction. And the question is, once we get our risk prediction, right, so you have a 70% probability of not surviving beyond 1 week if we give you surgery. That's the facts. Where the ethics comes in is what do we do about that fact? And whether we decide that surgery is worth it in that case is really a value judgment. It's really about how we weigh different benefits against different risks. So we're always talking about our values and our preferences when we make those kind of judgments. And different people can make those judgments differently. In fact, there's quite a lot of literature out there about asking doctors about how they would define futile in terms of probabilities. And actually, I might ask you, 1%? Higher than 1%? By which I mean 1% chance of survival. If somebody had a 1% chance of survival, would you think that was futile? Yep. 20%? No? Okay. 20%, anybody would go for 20%? Yeah. 10%? Yeah. 5%? What I'm getting at is it's actually really difficult. I mean, we can all say that the person that has like a 0.01% chance of survival, that it's futile, right? The difficulty is then, if we steadily increase the chance of survival, at what point do we stop saying that it's futile? And different people draw that line in different places. And in fact, there's a very large range of probabilities that different doctors will give. So some of them will say if it's less than 50% chance of survival, then it's futile, right? Which seems a little bit, maybe a bit too pessimistic to me. But we all have different opinions about that. And so when we're talking about value judgments, we can't necessarily discount the idea that the patient actually does understand exactly what the risk is, what the benefits to them are or are not, and what the nature of their choice is. It's just that they're making a different weighing of those risks versus those benefits. And in that case, paternalism is somewhat less justifiable. Now, I'm not necessarily saying now you need to go out and operate on all of those patients that you don't want to operate on. What I'm saying is it's actually a very difficult determination to make whether the patient actually understands and is just making a different value judgment, or whether they don't understand. Right? And they might say they understand, but I mean, we've already heard that people are not very good at probabilities and risks. Doctors themselves say, I'm not very good at probabilities and risks. Lay people, non-doctors, are quite bad at it. They're quite bad at translating that into what that means for them personally. And culturally, there's a lot of messages out there that tell people to discount risks and probabilities and stuff like that. If you go on TV, there's miracle cures and, people beating the odds and surviving when they were told they wouldn't. There's something called the availability heuristic, which says that we tend to think something is more probable the more easily we can imagine it. And this actually leads us astray a lot in probability judgments, because we find something easier to imagine and we think it's more likely. So when we have television, movies, our culture is filled with stories of miraculous recoveries and people surviving despite the odds and pulling through, we find that easier to imagine. We find it harder to imagine, the kind of poor quality of life and existence on a respirator that actually might be a much more common thing to happen. So even though people might understand the numbers, they might not truly be able to imagine what's likely to happen to them after surgery. So understanding is a very difficult thing to establish. The other thing is that we shouldn't be necessarily sure that we understand what patients are aiming for out of surgery. And it's very important, I think, to try and establish that. So some people might just want to know that they did everything possible. Right? There's something called an expressive function of certain actions. So if I, say I couldn't get the computer to work and I kick the lectern, right, I'm not actually trying to get the computer to work, I'm expressing my frustration. That's an expressive action. And you can think of some kinds of decisions as expressing certain attitudes. I think this is more likely to happen with relatives who might want to express the fact that they don't want to give up on their relative and might want surgery done, because refusing surgery or saying no to surgery and saying, yep, that's okay, we're not going to do anything, is giving up on them. So I think we have to be kind of sensitive to that as well and understand exactly what they're trying to do. So I think it's kind of difficult to actually say that it's justifiable to say no because the surgery is futile or the surgery is not in the patient's best interest. Not because it's never true, but because it's very difficult to establish whether it's true. What I think we sometimes forget, and I think doctors sometimes forget because they're trained to think of themselves as having their only role is to advocate for the patient's best interests. But I think we forget that we're also using resources that are scarce and that not everybody can have the exact amount of medical treatment that they always want to have. I think it's not just the patient's views on surgery that need to be considered, it's society's view on what kinds of surgery are justifiable and what are not. I think we as a society are actually very bad at having that conversation, and yet we very badly need to have it, because what's happening at the moment is that we're relying on doctors who, as I said, have been trained to think of themselves as advocating only for the patient's best interests, to be gatekeepers to scarce resources and to consider not just the patient's best interests, but whether this is wasteful to do these kinds of operations on patients who want them and yet probably shouldn't have them. As a society, we are not very good at confronting this. We tend to think only about, we get the story about the poor woman who's been denied surgery and she's going to die, and we think, oh no, give her the surgery. We're not very mature at having these conversations, I don't think. Anyway, so in conclusion, I don't have any pretty pictures on this slide, I'm sorry. What we need to think about if we're going to ethically make these kind of decisions is that we need to truly understand what the patient or their relatives are trying to achieve when they disagree with us. And this can be part of the conversation where we don't actually end up in the situation of having to say no to them. I think if we want to go down the road of denying treatment on the basis that it's not in their best interest, we need to establish whether they truly understand. And that can be a matter of trying to see how well they understand the implications of the decision, how well they understand the risks. One thing, by the way, that there's some evidence for, because this conversation came up before about communicating risk to patients, people often understand probabilities better as frequencies. So a 70% risk of death, we don't actually really know what to do with that. But if you said, of 10 patients in your situation, 7 will die, right, and 3 will live, it's a lot easier for people to handle that kind of information. So that's a way that it can be communicated to them in a way that they will internalise a little bit more and be able to make better decisions on. But I think the most important question is, should we, as a society, allow these sorts of decisions purely to be decided by patients themselves? Should we actually allow people to have surgery that might be very expensive and might consume a lot of resources? And I don't just mean, financial or equipment, I mean the doctor's time and the doctor's emotional energy as well. Just because they don't want to give up on their relative. I'm being barked off. But fortunately, I'm nearly finished. I do think that doctors have a role to play in deciding and in trying to think about the distributional implications and the fairness of offering certain kinds of resources to patients when it's overwhelmingly unlikely to work. On the other hand, I think the responsibility has to come back to the rest of us to start having those conversations. Thanks.